In the beginning, there was grey, arch trees, stone dragons, and fog. Then the first flame appeared, and with it, a lord who would become the most powerful god in the world, Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight. He slew the dragons. He built Anor Londo. He ruled the Age of Fire. And then, when that fire began to fade, he made a choice. A desperate, selfish choice that would curse the world for thousands of years. He prolonged an age that was meant to end. And by the time we meet him in the kiln, he's not a god anymore. He's a hollow husk, a broken lord guarding a dying flame. This is the complete story of Gwyn, from the war against the dragons to the moment you, the player, put him out of his misery. Subscribe if you enjoyed Dark Souls lore. Now let's begin. In the earliest days of existence, before the concepts of life or death were even a thought, the world was a place of total, unmoving stillness. This era is known as the Age of Ancients. It wasn't a world of light or dark, but a reality shrouded in a thick, endless fog that covered everything like a heavy blanket. There were no forests, no oceans, and no civilizations to speak of. Instead, the landscape was dominated by massive, towering arch trees that stretched up into the grey sky, and beneath them, the everlasting dragons ruled supreme. These dragons weren't like the beasts we see later in history. They were biologically immortal, armored in stone scales that protected them from the concept of time itself. In this world, nothing ever died, but nothing was ever truly alive either. It was a world that was unformed and unchanging, a grey crag where the wind never blew and the sun never rose. During this silent era, Gwyn existed in a state that's hard for us to imagine today. He wasn't a god yet, and he certainly wasn't a king. He was simply one of many hollow-like beings that dwelled deep underground in the dark. These creatures lived in the shadows of the world, far beneath the roots of the arch trees and the watchful eyes of the dragons. They were small, frail, and possessed no real power of their own. They were part of a subterranean collective, waiting for something to happen in a world where nothing ever changed. Gwyn and his kin were defined by their lack of identity. They were nameless, faceless, and lived in a state of perpetual quiet, perhaps not even knowing that a vast grey world existed above their heads. This underground existence is critical to understanding Gwyn's later character and his motivations. He knew what it was like to have nothing. He knew the feeling of being a small, insignificant speck in a world owned by immortal giants. This initial state of powerlessness is likely what fueled his later obsession with control and his absolute terror of losing his light. He didn't want to go back to the dark, and he certainly didn't want to be a hollow dwelling in the dirt again. At this point in history, Gwyn was just a passenger in a reality that didn't care about his existence. He was waiting for a spark, a tiny flicker of something new that could disrupt the grey status quo. That spark was coming, and when it finally arrived, it would transform this quiet, subterranean being into the most powerful entity the world had ever seen. Imagine the atmosphere of that time. There was no sound of birds, no rustle of leaves, and no heat from a sun. There was only the sound of the fog and the heavy breathing of dragons who had existed for eons. The beings underground lived in a cold, silent void. This lack of disparity meant there was no ambition and no hope. Gwyn was born into a world that didn't yet know what fire was. He was born into an unchanging reality where the idea of a crown was unthinkable. This beginning shaped him into a lord who would eventually do anything to prevent the world from returning to that state of grey nothingness. He was Gwyn's guarantee that the fire would never fade, once he finally had it in his grasp. Deep within the earth, in the heart of the darkness where Gwyn and the others lived, something impossible happened that changed the rules of existence forever. A flame spontaneously ignited. This wasn't a simple campfire or a forest fire. It was the first flame, a burst of energy that introduced disparity into the world. Before the flame, everything was the same, but the fire introduced opposites: heat and cold, life and death, and most importantly for Gwyn, light and dark. The world was no longer unformed, it was split into two, and that division created the potential for change, for growth, and for massive conflict. Gwyn was one of the 4 beings who had the courage to venture into the heat of this new light. He didn't just stand back and watch it from the shadows. He reached into the first flame itself and claimed a piece of its power. This was a Lord Soul. This wasn't just a boost in physical strength. It was a divine upgrade that granted him the powers of a god. While the other beings claimed souls that represented death or chaos, Gwyn claimed the power of light. This soul gave him the authority to shape the world and the raw power to challenge the dragons who had ruled the Grey Crags for eternity. It was the moment the transition of power began. This discovery was the true birth of the Age of Fire. Gwyn was no longer a hollow dwelling in the dirt. He was a lord. He looked at the world above and saw a grey wasteland that belonged to creatures of stone, and he decided that it was time for a new order. The first flame gave him the tools to make that dream a reality. But even in this moment of absolute triumph, the seeds of his later madness were planted. The fire had introduced life, but it had also introduced death. It had brought light, but it had created the dark. Gwyn realized that his new power was tied to a source that could, one day, flicker and die. From the very second he picked up his Lord Soul, he was locked into a race against the darkness. He spent his early years alongside his family, forming a royal family that represented the peak of divine power. But all of that power came from that single moment in the dark when he reached into the fire. He wasn't just another god. He was the heir to the sunlight itself. He was proof that the age of grey fog and stone dragons could finally end. This discovery didn't just give him power, it gave him a purpose. He became the architect of a new era, a prince of the storm who was ready to bring the fire to the surface and claim the world for his own kind. The discovery of the flame was the spark that ignited the greatest war the world would ever see. The soul that Gwyn pulled from the first flame was the soul of light, and it changed the way the world worked on a fundamental level. This soul didn't just make him strong, it granted him the ability to manifest and manipulate lightning. In the lore of the gods, this lightning was referred to as sunlight. It was a raw, aggressive energy that crackled in Gwyn's veins and flowed through his fingers like it was part of his own spirit. He didn't need to learn miracles from a book or earn them through discipline. This power was innate. He could channel lightning through his body like it was part of his very soul. This power was the key to the war that was about to come. The everlasting dragons were considered invincible because of their stone scales, which granted them a form of biological immortality. Normal weapons couldn't even scratch them, but Gwyn's lightning was different. It was the only thing in existence that was capable of breaching those stone scales and peeling them away. By using his bolts of sunlight, Gwyn could strip a dragon of its armor, making it vulnerable to death for the first time in history. This made him the supreme military leader of the new gods. He wasn't just a king, he was a walking weapon, who could dismantle the old world with a strike of lightning. Gwyn's Lord Soul also gave him the ability to grant power to others. He could take fragments of his sunlight and bestow them upon his knights and his family, creating an entire army of warriors who could wield the power of the storm. This established the hierarchy of Anor Londo. At the top was Gwyn, the source of the light, and beneath him were the beings who served his vision. He used his soul to build a religion of strength and discipline, where the ability to channel lightning was seen as the ultimate sign of divine favor. He wasn't just a man who found a flame. He was the architect of a new reality, a lord who used the power of light to end the age of grey and begin the age of fire. From the moment he drew breath after claiming the soul, the power of the storm was in his veins. To Gwyn, this power made him perfect. It made him the ideal successor to the old world, the one who would enforce the new order after the fire changed everything. He was shaped into the ultimate enforcer of the Age of Fire, a living weapon who would lead armies and destroy anything that threatened the light. To the early humans who served the gods, he was hope in human form, a prince whose very presence pushed back the ancient world. He was the crown jewel of the new era, and his lightning was the guarantee that the grey would never return. Gwyn was incredibly powerful, but he wasn't foolish enough to think he could take on the dragons entirely alone. The war for the world required more than just lightning. It required an alliance of lords who each brought something unique to the battlefield. Gwyn reached out to the other beings who had claimed souls from the first flame. He found Nito, the first of the dead, who held a soul that represented the absolute end of life. He also found the Witch of Izalith, a master of fire and chaos who could burn the world down. Together, these three lords formed the core of the rebellion against the ancients. However, even with the power of death and chaos on their side, the war was a stalemate for a long time. The dragons were too numerous and their scales were too thick. The tide only truly turned when Gwyn found an unlikely ally, Seath the Scaleless. Seath was a dragon, but he was born with a defect. He had no stone scales. Because of this, he was mortal and lived in a state of perpetual envy toward his own kind. Seath betrayed the other dragons and revealed the secret to destroying them to Gwyn. He told the Lord that the scales were the source of their immortality and that they could be peeled away with lightning. This alliance was the foundation of the new world. Gwyn was the military leader, Nito was the reaper, and the Witch of Izalith was the forge. Seath was the advisor, the one who provided the intellectual edge that the gods lacked. They were a terrifying team. While Gwyn's knights peeled the scales, Nito released miasmas of death and disease that rotted the dragons from the inside out. The witch and her daughters of chaos burned the archtrees to the ground, leaving the dragons with nowhere to hide. It was a systematic genocide of the old world, led by four beings who were tired of living in the grey. Gwyn had successfully united the disparate powers of the flame into a single, lethal force. This alliance showed that Gwyn was a master of politics as much as he was a master of war. He knew how to bring together different powers for a single goal, but it also showed his ruthlessness. He was willing to align himself with a traitor like Seath to get what he wanted. This alliance defined the hierarchy of the coming age. The lords would rule and the traitor would be rewarded, while the ancient world was burned to ash. It was a victory built on a foundation of blood and betrayal, and it ensured that the Age of Fire would begin on Gwyn's terms. Once the war was won and the Age of Fire began, Gwyn realized he needed a permanent elite vanguard to maintain his new order. He couldn't be everywhere at once, and his Silver Knights needed generals they could look up to for guidance. This led to the creation of the Four Knights of Gwyn, an elite group of legendary warriors who were the absolute peak of martial skill. These four were more than just soldiers. They were the enforcers of Gwyn's will across the entire realm of Lordran. They were tasked with the most dangerous missions, from hunting the last of the dragons to containing the encroaching darkness. The group was led by Dragon Slayer Ornstein, the captain of the guard who fought with a lightning-infused spear. Then there was Artorius, the Abyss Walker, the physically gifted knight who specialized in fighting the dark. Joining them was Chiaran, the Lord's Blade, a master of assassination who dealt with the god's enemies from the shadows. Finally, there was Hawkeye Goth, a giant archer whose great bow could bring down a dragon from miles away. These four represented the diverse strengths of Gwyn's military. They were the shield and the sword of Anor Londo, a symbol of the god's absolute superiority over any threat that might arise. These knights weren't just chosen for their strength. They were chosen for their absolute loyalty to the throne. Gwyn granted each of them a special ring that enhanced their natural abilities and signified their high status in the kingdom. They were the public face of the Age of Fire's military might. When people saw Ornstein's golden armor or Artoria's great shield, they knew that the light of Gwyn was nearby. These generals served as the blueprint for all combat in the New World. They personally trained the Silver Knights and oversaw the defenses of the city, ensuring that the peace Gwyn had fought so hard for would never be disturbed. Gwyn's firstborn was often found alongside these knights, forming a royal family that represented the peak of divine power. The firstborn was the heir to the sunlight and the one who would eventually enforce the new order after the fire changed everything. He grew up in the high halls of what would become Anor Londo, surrounded by the finest weapons and armor the gods could forge. His education was about strikes, parries, and channeling solar energy into lethal force. He was being shaped into the ultimate enforcer, a commander who knew the name of every knight in his vanguard. This elite structure ensured that Gwyn's reign would be secure for centuries to come. The war against the dragons was a brutal, industrial affair that required a very specific strategy to succeed. Gwyn knew that the only way to kill a dragon was to take away its immortality, and he did this through his famous lightning bolts. During the height of the conflict, Gwyn led his army of Silver Knights directly into the heart of the dragon's territory. He would stand at the front of the line, his hands crackling with the power of the sun, and unleash massive bolts of sunlight that struck the dragons with incredible force. These strikes didn't just hurt the dragons, they peeled their stone scales away. This peeling process was the turning point of every battle in the war. Once a dragon lost its scales, it was no longer an eternal being. It became a creature of flesh and blood, susceptible to the new concept of death that the first flame had introduced. This was when the rest of the alliance would move in for the kill. With the dragon's defenses stripped, Nito could unleash his miasmas of death to rot their bodies, and the Witch of Izalith could use her fire to burn the archtrees and the dragons to ash. Gwyn's lightning was the key that unlocked the door to victory. The Silver Knights followed Gwyn's example, using smaller versions of his miracles to support the front lines. The air would be filled with the sound of thunder and the smell of ozone as thousands of lightning spears rained down on the archtrees. It was a total war, a violent rejection of the stillness that had defined the Age of Ancients. Gwyn's role in this war was that of a conqueror who refused to accept any compromise. He wasn't interested in coexistence. He wanted extinction for the old world. By peeling the scales of the dragons, he was literally stripping the ancient world of its armor, paving the way for the Age of Fire to rise. This tactical mastery was passed down to his firstborn, who became the architect of the Dragon Slayers. The firstborn realized that traditional weapons weren't enough, so he designed the Dragon Slayer sword spear. This massive weapon was built for one purpose: to find the cracks in a dragon's armor and deliver concentrated lightning directly into their core. He personally oversaw the forging of these weapons, making sure the lightning infusions were perfect. Every knight who served the sunlight studied his movements, making him the blueprint for all elite combat in Anor Londo. The lightning wasn't just a weapon, it was the tool that cut through immortality itself. While Gwyn's lightning was the primary weapon of the war, the total victory would have been impossible without the information provided by Seath the Scaleless. Seath was a dragon born without the stone scales that made his kind immortal. He was a pariah among his own people, a creature who lived in constant fear of his own mortality while watching his siblings live forever. This jealousy turned into a cold, calculating hatred for his own kind. Seath approached Gwyn and offered him the secret to destroying the dragons, the fact that their scales were their only protection. Because of Seath's intelligence, the dragons were systematically hunted to the brink of extinction. Gwyn knew exactly where to strike and how to bypass the dragon's natural defenses. When the war finally ended and the last of the arch trees had burned, Gwyn didn't forget the dragon who had helped him secure his throne. He rewarded Seath with a high-ranking position in the new hierarchy of the gods. Seath was granted a dukedom and a massive crystal-filled library known as the Duke's Archives. He was also given a fragment of Gwyn's own Lord Soul, integrating the dragon traitor into the very fabric of divine society. Seath's betrayal is one of the most significant events in the history of Lordran, because it showed that Gwyn was willing to work with monsters if it helped him secure his power. By bringing Seath into the fold, Gwyn wasn't just rewarding a spy, he was keeping a close eye on a potential threat. Seath spent the rest of his life in his archives, obsessing over the secrets of immortality and magic, eventually losing his mind to his own research. But for a time, he was a pillar of Gwyn's kingdom. The fall of the dragons was a joint effort between the light of the gods and the bitterness of a traitor. This victory marked the beginning of the end for the ancient dragons. The Prince of the Storm had arrived, and the storm had finally broken the old world. Gwyn had taken a world of grey and turned it into a world of fire, and he had done it through a combination of raw power and strategic alliances. But the irony is that the same betrayal that built his kingdom would eventually be mirrored in his own family. Just as Seath betrayed the dragons, Gwyn's own firstborn would eventually betray him, leading to an exile that would haunt the royal family forever. The dragon's fall was complete, and the Age of Fire had truly dawned. With the final arch trees reduced to smouldering ash, and the last of the everlasting dragons driven into the dark corners of the world, Gwyn ascended as the supreme king of the gods. The stillness of the grey era was officially over, replaced by a world of warmth, movement, and light. This transition ushered in the Age of Fire, a period of unprecedented prosperity that would define the history of Lordran for thousands of years. Gwyn was no longer a hollow-like being dwelling in the dirt. He was the architect of a new reality, a lord who had successfully bent the forces of nature to his will. He stood atop the world he had conquered, and for the first time, the sun rose over a land that was no longer shrouded in fog. The early years of the Age of Fire were a time of massive expansion and building. Gwyn didn't just want to rule, he wanted to create a civilization that reflected the grandeur of his Lord Soul. This era saw the rise of massive kingdoms and the establishment of the Way of White, a powerful religion centered entirely on the worship of Gwyn and the sun. This wasn't just a spiritual movement, it was a societal foundation. It taught the mortals that the gods were their protectors and that the light was the only thing keeping the ancient chaos at bay. Through this religion, Gwyn ensured that his authority was felt in every home and every temple across the land. He was the source of all life, and the people looked to him as the ultimate guardian of their future. As the king of the gods, Gwyn oversaw the creation of a world that functioned on the concepts of order and hierarchy. He established laws, trade routes, and military structures that allowed his subjects to flourish under the glow of the first flame. This was the dawn of civilization as we know it in the Soul's universe. The fear of the dragons was replaced by a sense of security, as the sunlight miracles of the gods were used to bless the fields and heal the sick. It was a golden age in the truest sense of the word. Gwyn's vision was of a world that would never go back to the grey, a world where the fire would burn bright enough to push back the shadows forever. He was the sun in human form, a prince whose very presence guaranteed that the new era would be one of endless light. However, even in this peak of prosperity, the nature of the fire remained a concern. The Age of Fire was a beautiful dream, but it was a dream that relied on a flickering source. Gwyn knew that his power was tied to the flame, and as he looked out over his growing empire, he must have realized that maintaining this light would eventually require more than just lightning and stone. But for now, the world was his. He had brought fire to the darkness and built a home for his kind among the clouds. The victory was total, and the dawn of the Age of Fire was the moment that humanity and the gods alike felt that the world was finally, truly theirs. To solidify his rule and create a physical manifestation of his divinity, Gwyn constructed Anor Londo, the massive cathedral city that served as the seat of power for the gods. Perched high atop a mountain, bathed in eternal sunlight, Anor Londo was designed to be a place that looked down upon the rest of the world. Its architecture was a marvel of white stone, golden trim, and towering spires that reached toward the heavens. Every street, every bridge, and every palace was built to showcase the absolute superiority of the divine family. It wasn't just a city, it was a statement. It told everyone who looked up at the mountains that the gods were unreachable, eternal, and all-powerful. From this high throne, Gwyn ruled over the land of Lordran with a firm but radiant hand. The city was guarded by the Silver Knights, elite warriors who had fought alongside Gwyn in the Dragon Wars and now served as the guardians of his legacy. The inner sanctums of the city were filled with the finest weapons and armor the gods could forge, creating an atmosphere of martial perfection. Anor Londo was a place of ritual and light, where the sunlight was filtered through massive stained glass windows to create an environment that felt holy. It was the crown jewel of the Age of Fire, a testament to what could be achieved when the power of a Lord Soul was focused on creation rather than destruction. The layout of the city was strategic as well as aesthetic. It was built to be a fortress that no mortal army could ever hope to breach. With its massive elevators, rotating bridges, and narrow walkways guarded by archers, Anor Londo was a literal maze designed to protect the royal family from any potential threat. But more than that, it was a psychological tool. The sheer scale of the buildings made humans feel small and insignificant, reinforcing the idea that they were subjects of a higher order. Gwyn wanted his people to feel awe when they thought of his home. He wanted them to believe that the light in Anor Londo would never fade, even if the rest of the world fell into shadow. In the center of this golden city sat the great cathedral, where Gwyn held court and managed the affairs of his kingdom. This was the heart of the world, the place where the laws of the gods were written and the miracles of the sunlight were refined. Anor Londo was the peak of the Age of Fire's architectural and spiritual achievement. It represented a world where the gods were in total control and where the darkness of the Age of Ancients was a forgotten memory. But as we know, even the tallest towers have foundations, and the foundation of Anor Londo was a fire that was already starting to demand a price for its brilliance. Gwyn's legacy wasn't just built on stone and fire, it was built on his bloodline. He had 3 primary children who each represented a different aspect of his power and his personality. His firstborn, his daughter Guinevere, and his youngest son, Gwendolyn. The firstborn was the god of war, a massive physical powerhouse who was groomed to be Gwyn's military heir. He was the heir to the sunlight, a prince who carried the power of the storm in his veins and led the dragon slayers into battle. To Gwyn, the firstborn was the ideal successor, the one who would enforce the new order with a spear of lightning. He was the pride of the royal family, the crown jewel of the new era. Then there was Guinevere, the princess of sunlight, where the firstborn represented the harsh, unforgiving light of the storm. Guinevere embodied the warmth and fertility of the sun. She was the heart of Anor Londo, a goddess of bounty who provided comfort and hope to the people. She was the public face of the gods' kindness, a figure of grace who made the Age of Fire feel like a time of peace, rather than just a time of war. Guinevere was deeply loved by both the gods and the humans, and her presence in the city was a constant reminder of the prosperity that Gwyn had brought to the world. Finally, there was Gwendolyn, the youngest of the 3. Gwendolyn was born with an affinity for the moon rather than the sun, a trait that was considered a source of deep shame for Gwyn. Because of this connection to the moon, Gwendolyn was raised as a daughter, hidden away in the shadows of the cathedral. He was known as the Darksign, a title that reflected his complicated position within the family. While his siblings were celebrated in the open light, Gwendolyn practiced the arts of illusion and sorcery in the dark. He was a master of the moonlight, a power that was often seen as the opposite of Gwyn's own sunlight. This rejection by his father would shape Gwendolyn into a loyal yet secretive guardian of the city's illusions. This family dynamic was the core of the divine hierarchy, but it was also a source of great tension. Gwyn was a traditionalist who valued strength and solar power above all else. He wanted heirs who reflected his own glory perfectly. The fact that his youngest son was tied to the moon was a crack in the facade of his perfect family. Meanwhile, his relationship with his firstborn was built on military expectation, a bond that would eventually be tested by the prince's own shifting loyalties. The royal family of Anor Londo was a peak of divine power, but beneath the golden armor and the sunlight miracles, there were deep fractures that would eventually contribute to the fall of the kingdom. The greatest blow to Gwyn's family and his legacy came when his firstborn committed an act of ultimate betrayal. The god of war, the man groomed to be the ultimate protector of the Age of Fire, allied himself with the ancient dragons. We don't know the exact reasons for this shift, but it's clear that the prince began to see the dragons as more than just enemies to be hunted. He found a kinship with them, perhaps respecting their strength or their ancient connection to the world. For Gwyn, this wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was a total rejection of everything the gods stood for. The man who was supposed to be the heir to the sunlight had joined the very creatures that the sunlight was meant to destroy. In a fit of absolute divine rage, Gwyn decided to erase his son from history. He stripped the firstborn of his deific status and ordered that his name be removed from every scroll, every statue, and every archive in Lordran. The prince became the nameless king, a ghost of a man whose identity was torn from the world he was supposed to lead. His statues were broken, and his memory was treated as a curse. This was Gwyn's first major family tragedy, and it left him with a massive void in his heart and his kingdom. He had lost his primary masculine heir, the one who was supposed to carry the torch of the Age of Fire into the future. The exile of the nameless king had a profound impact on Gwyn's mental state. It made him more paranoid and more controlling. He had seen his own blood turn against his vision, and it taught him that even the strongest light could be corrupted. This betrayal reinforced Gwyn's belief that he was the only one who could truly be trusted to protect the fire. He doubled down on his efforts to control the world, becoming more tyrannical in his pursuit of stability. The empty pedestal where his son's statue once stood became a symbol of the cost of the Age of Fire. It was a reminder that the gods were not as unified as they appeared, and that the shadows were already starting to find their way into the high halls of Anor Londo. This event also changed the fate of Gwyndolin. With the firstborn gone and Guinevere eventually leaving to marry a flame god, Gwyndolin became the only child left to tend to the city. The dark son, who had been hidden away out of shame, was now the only one guarding his father's empty throne. The exile of the firstborn was the moment the royal family truly began to fall apart. It showed that even the most powerful king could be wounded by his own children, and it set a precedent for the many betrayals that would follow as the fire began to fade and the dark began to rise. As the Age of Fire progressed and the kingdom grew larger, Gwyn realized that he could no longer manage the entire world alone. He needed to delegate his power to ensure the stability of the realm. To do this, he decided to fragment his own Lord Soul, sharing pieces of his divine essence with those he deemed worthy of ruling alongside him. This was a strategic move designed to create a network of powerful governors who could maintain order in the distant corners of Lordran. Gwyn gave a significant piece of his soul to the 4 kings of New Londo, humans who were respected for their leadership and their loyalty to the gods. He also gave a fragment to Seath the Scaleless, rewarding the dragon traitor for his continued research and his role in the Old War. This distribution of power allowed for a time of great administrative efficiency. New Londo became a magnificent city under the guidance of the 4 kings, serving as a hub for human civilization. Seath used his piece of the soul to fuel his experiments in the Duke's archives, uncovering secrets of sorcery that the world had never seen. Gwyn's influence was felt everywhere, as his soul acted as the fuel for the various institutions that kept the world running. But this move also had a hidden cost. By dividing his Lord's soul, Gwyn was literally weakening his own source of light. He was spreading his power thin, and the primary source of the flame was being diluted among several different entities. This decision reflected Gwyn's desire for absolute order. He wanted a world where every city and every library was tied directly to his own spirit. He wanted to be the root of all power, even if that meant giving pieces of himself away. But as the fire began to naturally wane, the fragmented nature of the Lord's soul became a problem. The power was no longer concentrated in one place where it could be easily protected or recharged. Instead, it was held by kings and dragons who had their own ambitions and their own vulnerabilities. Gwyn had built a world that relied on his essence, but in doing so, he had made the stability of the universe dependent on the continued loyalty and survival of his chosen governors. When the dark eventually began to creep into the hearts of men and the minds of the powerful, these fragments of the Lord's soul became targets. The four kings would eventually fall to the abyss, and Seath would descend into madness. The very pieces of power that Gwyn had used to build his kingdom became the instruments of its destruction. Dividing the soul was an act of a confident king who believed his light would last forever. But in the long run, it was one of the many tactical errors that left the Age of Fire vulnerable to the inevitable decay of time. Gwyn's greatest fear was never the dragons or the old world. It was the dark soul. He knew that within every human there was a fragment of the dark, a power that grew stronger as the fire grew weaker. He saw humanity not as his children, but as a potential threat to his throne. He believed that when the fire finally went out, the humans would rise up and claim the world, ending the reign of the gods forever. To prevent this Age of Dark from ever happening, Gwyn committed a horrific act of spiritual manipulation. He placed a ring of fire around the dark center of the human soul. This is the darksign, the curse that binds humanity to the Age of Fire. The darksign was designed to act as a seal. It forced the dark within humans to be perpetually fed into the first flame, using their own souls as kindling to keep the gods in power. It was a parasitic relationship. Every time a human died and returned to life, a piece of their humanity was burned away to fuel Gwyn's world. This ensured that humans would remain weak, fragmented, and dependent on the gods' religion. The light wasn't just a blessing, it was a cage. Gwyn had effectively shackled the entire human race to his own fading legacy, forcing them to suffer through a cycle of undeath so that the sun in Anor Londo wouldn't have to flicker. This curse is the reason for the hollow state that we see throughout the games. As the fire fades and the darksign tightens its grip, humans lose their memories, their sanity, and their physical form. They become empty husks, wandering the world without purpose. Gwyn viewed this as a necessary price for the continuation of his age. He didn't care about the suffering of mortals. He only cared about the survival of the fire. By branding humanity with the darksign, he committed his first sin, the act of forcing the natural order of the world to stay static when it was meant to change. He turned humans into cattle for the flame, a move that would eventually backfire and lead to the total collapse of his society. The darksign is the ultimate symbol of Gwyn's tyranny. It shows that he was willing to condemn an entire race to eternal agony just to stay on his throne for a few more centuries. He feared the dark so much that he tried to erase it, but in doing so, he created a world that was even more broken. The Undead Curse wasn't an accident. It was a calculated military decision by a king who was too afraid of the future to let the present end. Gwyn had brought light to the world, but with the darksign, he ensured that the light was built on a foundation of human misery and broken souls. Gwyn's paranoia regarding humanity can be traced back to the discovery of the first flame. While Gwyn, Nito, and the witch claimed their souls, there was a fourth figure who found a soul in the shadows, the furtive pygmy. This being claimed the dark soul, a soul that didn't provide immediate power, but instead had the ability to fragment and grow over time. The pygmy became the ancestor of all humans, and the fragments of the dark soul became the humanity that every person carries. Gwyn knew this, and he lived in constant terror of what would happen when those fragments finally came back together to form a new power that could challenge his own. He viewed the coming Age of Dark not as a natural progression of the world, but as a personal theft of his light. To Gwyn, the darkness was an encroaching rot that wanted to steal everything he had built. He couldn't understand the idea of a world that didn't revolve around his son. This fear drove him to become increasingly tyrannical. He spent his final centuries obsessing over the furtive pygmy's descendants, looking for any sign of a Dark Lord who might arise to claim his crown. He built the ringed city as a prison for the human lords, giving them a beautiful home that was actually a gilded cage, located at the very end of the world where he could keep them far away from his throne. This fear was the driving force behind almost all of Gwyn's major decisions. Every alliance he made and every curse he cast was a reaction to the invisible threat of the dark soul. He couldn't kill the dark, so he tried to hide it, bury it, and burn it away. But the more he fought against the natural cycle of the world, the more he caused the world to decay. His terror of the pygmy's legacy turned him into a monster. He stopped being a savior who brought light to the grey and became a jailer who was afraid of his own prisoners. The tragic irony is that by fearing the dark so much, Gwyn ensured that the dark would eventually be the only thing left. In the end, Gwyn's fear was his greatest weakness. It blinded him to the possibility of a world that could exist without him. He was a god of light who couldn't see past his own shadow. The furtive pygmy had stayed quiet, fragmenting his soul and waiting for the fire to naturally go out. But Gwyn's aggressive resistance turned a natural transition into a violent, agonizing struggle. He had spent his life fighting dragons, but his final enemy was something he couldn't hit with a lightning bolt: the simple passage of time. His fear of the dark soul was the crack in his divinity that eventually brought the entire Age of Fire crashing down. Despite his monumental efforts to secure his throne and the prosperity of his kingdom, the one thing Gwyn couldn't control was the fundamental nature of the fire itself. The first flame, which had brought disparity and power to the lords, wasn't an infinite resource. It began to naturally die out, flickering in the deep places of the world where it had first ignited. This shift marked the true end of the golden age of Anor Londo. The eternal sunlight that bathed the spires of the city began to lose its warmth, and the power that the gods drew from the flame started to wane. It was a slow, agonizing decline that no amount of prayer or lightning could stop. Gwyn watched as his empire began to lose its luster. The miracles that once felt like second nature to the gods became harder to manifest, and the divine aura that surrounded the royal family began to dim. This realization hit Gwyn with a force greater than any dragon's strike. He had built a world that was entirely dependent on a single spark, and now that spark was turning to ash. As the light faded, the shadows he had spent eons trying to contain began to creep back into the corners of reality. The sense of security that had defined the Age of Fire was replaced by a growing, cold dread. This period marked Gwyn's final descent into a desperate, frantic madness. He began to search for any possible way to restart the fire or find a new source of light. He turned to his advisors and the other lords, demanding solutions to a problem that was fundamentally unsolvable by traditional means. He was a king who was used to overcoming every obstacle with raw strength, but the fading of the fire was a conceptual enemy that he couldn't reach with a lightning bolt. Every day that passed without a solution was a day closer to the Age of Dark, the very thing he feared most in the universe. The fading of the flame didn't just affect the gods, it affected the world itself. The seasons began to blur, and the natural order of life and death started to fray at the edges. Without the strong presence of the fire to anchor reality, the world began to feel thin and unstable. Gwyn's obsession with the light blinded him to the possibility of any other way of living. He couldn't imagine a world that didn't revolve around his sun, and so he refused to let it go. This refusal would eventually lead him to commit the greatest acts of desperation in history, as he prepared to sacrifice everything to keep the shadows at bay for just a little while longer. Part 16, The Undead Curse, spreads across Lordran. As the first flame continued to lose its strength, the seal Gwyn had placed on humanity began to malfunction. The darksign, that ring of fire meant to contain the dark soul, started to manifest as a visible mark on the flesh of men. This was the beginning of the Undead Curse, a plague that would eventually dismantle the societal structure of Lordran. Humans who bore this mark could no longer find the peace of a natural death. Instead, they would return to life at the bonfires, their bodies slowly decaying and their minds slipping away with every rebirth. This chaos was the ultimate nightmare for Gwyn's orderly world. The kingdoms he had protected were now filled with immortals who were losing their sanity. These hollows became a drain on resources and a threat to the living, leading to the creation of asylums and the mass exile of the undead. The cycle of hollowing was a physical manifestation of the fading fire. As the light in the world died, the light within humanity died as well, leaving behind only the cold, hungry dark. Gwyn's attempt to shackle humanity to his age was backfiring, turning his subjects into monsters that roamed the streets of his empire. The spread of the curse was the final proof that the Age of Fire was ending. No matter how many undead were locked away, more would always rise. The fear that had once been reserved for the gods was now directed at the undead, creating a world of suspicion and terror. Gwyn watched from Anor Londo as the civilizations below him collapsed into madness. The Way of White, his own religion, struggled to contain the spiritual crisis, eventually turning to the hunting and branding of the undead as a way to maintain control. But even the gods' priests were not immune to the curse. The irony of the Undead Curse is that it was a product of Gwyn's own design. By trying to force the dark to fuel his light, he had created a system that refused to let things die. The world was becoming a stagnant, rotting pool where nothing could move forward. This stagnation was the true enemy of the Age of Fire. Gwyn realized that the only way to stop the spread of the curse and restore the light was to find a way to reinvigorate the first flame. But as the chaos intensified, he knew that time was running out. The world was screaming for a release that the fire could no longer provide, and the Lord of Sunlight was the only one left who could make the final, terrible choice. Part 17. Gwyn's desperate choice. With the world falling into ruin and the Undead Curse destroying his people, Gwyn reached the end of his options. He had seen others try to save the fire and fail spectacularly. The most notable failure was the Witch of Seath, who had attempted to use her soul to recreate the first flame from scratch. Instead of a new sun, she had birthed the Chaos Flame, a twisted parasitic fire that consumed her and her daughters, transforming them into the bed of chaos and unleashing demons upon the world. This tragedy convinced Gwyn that no magical shortcut would work. He realized that the only way to truly extend the Age of Fire was to provide the flame with a fuel so powerful that it could burn for centuries. This fuel had to be a Lord Soul. Gwyn looked at his own soul, the soul of light, and understood what he had to do. He decided that he would sacrifice himself to act as kindling for the first flame. It was a choice born of absolute desperation and a refusal to see the world move into the Age of Dark. He was willing to burn his own divinity to keep the sun shining over the ruins of his kingdom. This choice was the ultimate expression of Gwyn's character. He was a man of action who believed that his will could override the laws of the universe. By choosing to link the fire, he was attempting to force the world to remain in a state of light, even if that light was artificial and fueled by his own suffering. He gathered his remaining strength and prepared for a one-way trip to the center of the world. He said his goodbyes to his family, leaving Gwyndolin behind to maintain the illusions of Anor Londo, and marched toward the kiln. The weight of this decision cannot be overstated. Gwyn was the king of the gods, the conqueror of dragons, and the creator of civilization. By choosing to burn, he was admitting that the gods were no longer the masters of the world, but its servants. He was trading his life, his mind, and his future for a few more years of a status quo that was already falling apart. It was a heroic act in the eyes of his followers, but a tragic mistake in the eyes of history. Gwyn stepped into the darkness of the kiln, ready to offer himself to the fire, convinced that his sacrifice was the only way to save everything he had built. Part 18. The Black Knights. His final army. Gwyn didn't travel to the kiln of the first flame alone. He took with him a final vanguard consisting of half of his remaining silver knights. These were his most loyal soldiers, the men who had fought by his side since the dawn of the Age of Fire. They were prepared to follow their king into the very heart of the world, knowing that they'd likely never return. This final march was a somber, silent procession through the ash-covered wastes that led to the kiln. When Gwyn finally reached the first flame and threw himself into the fire, the resulting explosion of heat and light was beyond anything the world had ever seen. The power of his Lord Soul, combined with the original spark, created a pillar of fire that reached toward the heavens. The knights who stood nearby were caught in the blast. The intense heat charred their once shining silver armor to a deep, soot-covered black. They were no longer silver knights. They became the Black Knights. The fire didn't just change their armor. It burned away their physical bodies, leaving only their spirits bound to their blackened gear. These Black Knights now wander the world as disembodied, restless spirits. They were scattered by the force of the explosion, and many of them can be found guarding the outskirts of Gwyn's tomb or the path to the kiln. They are mindless husks of the warriors they once were, driven by a lingering instinct to protect their king and his fire. They are a physical reminder of the violent cost of linking the flame. Every time a traveler encounters a Black Knight, they're seeing a relic of Gwyn's final act of desperation. The transformation of his elite guard into these dark sentinels is a tragic echo of Gwyn's own fate. Just as Gwyn became a hollowed husk of a god, his knights became hollowed husks of soldiers. They are the silent witnesses to the end of the Age of Fire, standing watch over a world that's moved on without them. They represent the total commitment Gwyn demanded from his followers. Even in death, and even after their armor was burned black by his own sacrifice, they remain his final army, a group of ghosts haunting the ruins of a golden age that was bought with their lives. Part 19. The Journey to the Kiln of the First Flame. The journey to the Kiln of the First Flame was the final walk of a king who knew his reign was over. Gwyn left Anor Londo behind, descending from the high spires of the gods into the deep, dark roots of the world. He left Gwyndolin in charge of the city, instructing him to use his illusions to hide the truth from the remaining residents. Gwyn knew that if the people saw the sun flicker and the king disappear, the panic would be total. So, he chose to walk into the dark in secret, accompanied only by his doomed knights. The path to the kiln led him to a massive stone bowl designed to contain the original spark of reality. This area was a desolate, ash-covered wasteland that felt disconnected from the rest of Lordran. It was the place where time and space seemed to converge, a crucible where the fate of the world would be decided. As Gwyn approached the entrance, he knew there was no coming back. This was a one-way trip, a final duty to the fire that had given him everything. Walking through those massive stone gates, Gwyn was leaving behind the world of light he had built. He was stepping into the heart of the disparity, the very source of the heat and cold that defined his age. The environment was silent, save for the crackling of the dying flame and the heavy footsteps of his knights. For Gwyn, this wasn't a moment of fear, but a moment of grim resolve. He had spent his life fighting for the light, and he was prepared to give his last breath to see it continue. The kiln itself was a monument to the beginning of time. It was a massive circular arena where the first flame rested, a small and flickering shadow of its former glory. Gwyn stood before the spark, looking into the void that he'd spent his entire life trying to fill. He was the most powerful being in existence, standing at the center of the world, ready to be consumed. The journey to the kiln was the end of the legend of Gwyn the King, and the beginning of the tragedy of Gwyn the Kindling. He stepped forward into the ash, and the fire reached out to claim its lord. Part 20. Linking the Fire. Gwyn's Sacrifice. The moment Gwyn threw himself into the first flame is known as the First Link, and it's the most pivotal event in the history of the world. By using his own Lord Soul as fuel, Gwyn provided the fire with enough energy to explode back into life. This act successfully extended the Age of Fire for another 1,000 years, pushing back the encroaching darkness and allowing the world to remain in a state of light. To those watching from afar, it appeared as if the sun had suddenly regained its full strength, and the crisis of the fading flame was over. But this sacrifice came at a price that went beyond just Gwyn's life. By linking the fire, Gwyn was interfering with the natural cycle of the world. The Age of Fire was meant to end, making way for the Age of Dark, just as day naturally turns to night. Gwyn's refusal to let the light die was an act of supreme hubris. He was forcing the world to stay static, preventing it from moving forward into its next natural phase. This decision turned the natural order of the universe into a repetitive, artificial cycle. Gwyn's body was instantly consumed by the flame. He didn't just die, he was hollowed out by the heat. The fire took his skin, his mind, and his spirit, leaving behind only the physical shell of a man. He ceased to be the Lord of Sunlight and became the Lord of Cinder. He was no longer a king who ruled with wisdom and power. He was a piece of coal that happened to be shaped like a god. His sacrifice worked to keep the fire burning, but it didn't save the world. It only delayed the inevitable. The first link set a precedent that would haunt the world for eons. It established the idea that the fire could be maintained through sacrifice, leading to the creation of the cycle where countless undead would eventually follow in Gwyn's footsteps. Gwyn had shackled the world to his own fading legacy, ensuring that the history of Lordran would be a long, slow march toward a destination that he refused to let the world reach. He had saved the fire, but in doing so, he had doomed the world to a state of perpetual rot and stagnation. Part 21. Gwyn as Lord of Cinder. The empty husk. After the fire had finished its work, what remained in the kiln was no longer the Lord who had conquered the dragons. Gwyn had become a Lord of Cinder, a name that perfectly captured his new state. He was an empty, mindless husk, his skin scorched black and his eyes devoid of any spark of intelligence. Every bit of what made him Gwyn, his memories, his tactical brilliance, and his love for his family, had been burned away to fuel the flame. He was a physical ghost, a shell of divine armor filled with nothing but the instinct to protect the light. In this state, Gwyn was more of a force of nature than a person. He paced the ash-covered grounds of the kiln for nearly 1,000 years, a silent guardian of the dying spark. He no longer recognized the difference between a friend and an enemy. His only remaining instinct was to kill anything that approached the fire, because he could no longer understand the concept of a successor. He had become the very thing he once fought to contain, a mindless, hollow beast. The tragedy of the Lord of Cinder is that he was a victim of his own devotion. He had given everything to save his kingdom, but he wasn't there to see the result. He was trapped in a perpetual loop of aggression and heat, standing watch over a world that was slowly dying anyway. The radiance that once defined him was gone, replaced by the dull, flickering glow of a charcoal soul. He was the ultimate prisoner of the Age of Fire, a king who had become the kindling for his own throne. When we finally encounter him at the end of the journey, we aren't fighting a god. We are fighting a memory. He is fast and he is aggressive, but his movements are those of a desperate, broken thing. He is the hollowed-out center of a world that refused to change, a physical reminder of the cost of staying too long. Gwyn, as the Lord of Cinder, is the final image of the Age of Fire, a burned-out king guarding a pile of ash, waiting for a savior he's destined to try and kill. Part 22. Guarding the first flame for centuries. For nearly 1,000 years, the hollowed form of Gwyn paced the ash-covered grounds of the kiln, trapped in a state of eternal, mindless vigilance. He had become the final boss of the world, a tragic guardian whose only remaining purpose was to protect the dying spark of the fire from anyone who might approach. The radiance that once defined the Lord of Sunlight was completely gone, replaced by a dull, flickering glow that barely illuminated the shadows of his stone prison. He was a physical ghost, a shell of divine armor filled with nothing but the primal instinct to kill. In this desolate place, time had no meaning, and the king of the gods had become a prisoner of the very legacy he had sacrificed his soul to maintain. The tragedy of Gwyn's long watch was that he could no longer recognize the difference between a savior and a thief. He had spent his life building a system to find a successor, but his hollowed mind saw every visitor as a threat to the flame. This created a cruel paradox, where the very god who demanded the fire be linked would attempt to slaughter the only people capable of doing so. He was no longer a king who ruled with wisdom, but a mindless force of nature that functioned like a rusted machine. The kiln became a graveyard for any who dared to challenge the broken god, as Gwyn's aggression remained as fierce as it was during the Dragon Wars. The environment of the kiln reflected the stagnation of Gwyn's reign, filled with the white ash of burned souls and the remnants of his scorched knights. Gwyn paced this wasteland with a heavy, rhythmic step, his great sword dragging through the dust. He did not eat, he did not sleep, and he did not dream. He simply existed as a physical extension of the first flame. The fire was his only master, and he served it with a terrifying, singular focus that excluded all traces of his former humanity. He was the ultimate victim of the Age of Fire, a ruler who had become the kindling for his own throne, waiting in the silence for an end that he was destined to resist. During these centuries, the world above continued to rot, yet Gwyn remained oblivious to the decay of his empire. He did not know that Anor Londo had become a city of illusions, or that his children had scattered to the winds. His reality was narrowed down to the circle of ash surrounding the original spark. He was a monument to a past that had already vanished, a sentinel guarding a treasure that was slowly turning to grey nothingness. The isolation of the kiln ensured that Gwyn's descent into madness was total, leaving no room for regret or realization. He was simply the Lord of Cinder, a charcoal soul waiting for the next spark to ignite the cycle once more. This era of Gwyn's existence is perhaps the most somber chapter of the entire mythos, as it shows the total erasure of a divine identity. The man who had once commanded the sun was now just a pile of smouldering embers in the shape of a man. He represented the absolute limit of what a soul could endure before it was completely hollowed out. Every strike he leveled at a traveler was a strike delivered by a corpse, fueled by a fire that refused to let him rest. He was the gatekeeper of the end of the world, a tragic figure who stood at the center of the disparity, refusing to let the day turn into night. Part 23. The Chosen Undead's Arrival. The arrival of the Chosen Undead at the kiln was not an accident, but the final result of a massive centuries-long manipulation orchestrated by Gwyn's remaining followers. After collecting the fragmented pieces of the Lord Soul from the Four Kings and Seath, the player finally gains access to the altar that leads to Gwyn's tomb. This journey was the ultimate test of strength, designed to ensure that the person who reached the flame possessed a soul powerful enough to act as a suitable replacement for Gwyn's fading light. Characters like King Seeker Frampt acted as the shepherds of this prophecy, guiding the undead toward a sacrifice they didn't fully understand. As the player enters the kiln, they are walking through a landscape that exists outside of normal time, a place where the history of the world is reduced to ash. The Chosen Undead is the first living being to see the true state of Gwyn in over 1,000 years. The encounter represents the collision between the old world of the gods and the new world of the undead. Gwyn does not greet the player with words or ceremony. He greets them with a flaming sword and a violent leap. To the Lord of Cinder, the Chosen Undead is just another shadow trying to steal the light, a thief that must be destroyed to protect the flame. This arrival marks the moment where Gwyn's original plan finally comes to fruition, even if he is no longer sane enough to witness it. He had created the cycle of the undead specifically to find a fuel source that could sustain the Age of Fire when his own soul was spent. The player is the ultimate harvest, a collection of humanity and lordly power that has been refined through the struggle of the journey. By reaching the kiln, The Chosen Undead has proven they are the perfect kindling. The tragedy is that the only reward for this heroic achievement is the opportunity to burn in the same fire that destroyed the king. The player's presence in the kiln is a testament to the sheer persistence of the human spirit, the very thing Gwyn feared most. While the gods had faded and the old kingdoms had crumbled, the pygmies' descendants had survived and grown stronger. The Chosen Undead stands before the broken god not as a servant, but as a superior combatant who has overcome the trials of Lordran. This is the ultimate irony of Gwyn's reign. He built a world to suppress humanity, but it was a human who eventually arrived to decide whether his world would live or die. The arrival at the kiln is the final act of a 1,000-year-old script written in fire and blood. In this final stage of the journey, the player sees the Black Knights for what they truly are, ghosts of a failed defense. They wander the ash of the kiln, guarding a king who is already dead and a fire that is already out. The Chosen Undead moves past these relics of the past to face the core of the problem. The path is lined with the memories of Gwyn's final army, a somber walk that emphasizes the loneliness of the divine sacrifice. By the time the player reaches the Fog Gate, the legend of Gwyn the Great is gone, leaving only the reality of the fight that lies ahead. Part 24. The Final Battle. Fighting the Broken God. The battle against Gwyn is designed to be one of the most melancholic and somber moments in the history of the Age of Fire. Unlike the other gods or monsters the player has faced, Gwyn does not use complex magic or grand illusions. He fights with a simple, brutal efficiency, using a massive sword of fire to deliver fast, aggressive strikes. He is a glass cannon, a warrior who can deal incredible damage, but is physically fragile due to his scorched state. The most telling part of the fight is that he can be parried, a gameplay mechanic that serves as a narrative sign of his greatly diminished power. The music that plays during the encounter, titled Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, is a famous piano piece that avoids the bombastic orchestras of other boss fights. It is a sad, repetitive melody that reflects the tragedy of a king who has lost everything. This music tells the player that they aren't fighting a villain, but a broken man who is fighting for a world that has already died. Every swing of Gwyn's sword feels like a desperate attempt to hold onto a dream that turned into a nightmare. There is no glory in this battle, only the heavy weight of a legacy that has reached its inevitable, violent conclusion. Gwyn's moveset is a shadow of what it must have been during the war against the dragons. He still possesses the speed of the storm, but his movements lack the grace and purpose of a true lord. He lunges and grabs with a mindless ferocity, acting more like a rabid animal than a master of the sunlight. The fact that the player can deflect his blows and riposte through his chest is a final humiliation for the Lord of Sunlight. It shows that the age of the gods is over, and that even their highest king can be laid low by the very humans he once cursed with the darksign. The arena itself, a circular bowl of ash and stone, creates a sense of claustrophobia and finality. There is nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. It is a struggle to the death at the very center of reality. Gwyn's flame flickers with every strike, his body leaking embers instead of blood. He is a creature made of charcoal and regret, a physical manifestation of the first sin that cursed the world to this cycle of rot. When the player finally lands the finishing blow, Gwyn does not let out a grand final word. He simply fades into ash, leaving his soul behind for the player to claim. This final fight serves as the ultimate verdict on Gwyn's reign. It shows that while he brought light to the world, he did so at a cost that eventually hollowed out the world and himself. The battle is a mercy killing, a chance for the Lord of Cinder to finally stop pacing the ash and find the rest that has been denied to him for 1,000 years. As his body dissipates, the music fades, leaving the player alone with the first flame. The broken god is gone, and the future of the world now rests entirely in the hands of the undead who defeated him. Part 25. The Link the Fire ending versus the Dark Lord ending. After the defeat of Gwyn, the player is presented with the ultimate choice that defines the fate of reality: to link the fire or to walk away. If the Chosen Undead chooses to link the fire, they approach the small, flickering spark and offer their soul to the flame. This results in a massive explosion of light as the player is consumed, burning to ash just as Gwyn did centuries before. This choice continues Gwyn's cycle, extending the Age of Fire for another period of time and keeping the sun shining over Lordran for a few more generations. It is a heroic sacrifice that ensures the world of the gods does not immediately fall into the dark. However, linking the fire is also a choice to embrace Gwyn's lie and continue the stagnation of the world. By burning, the player becomes the next Lord of Cinder, destined to eventually hollow out and pace the kiln just as Gwyn did. The cycle of the Undead Curse will eventually return, and the fire will inevitably begin to fade again, requiring yet another sacrifice. It is a temporary fix for a terminal problem, a refusal to let the natural order of the world take its course. Those who link the fire are remembered as heroes by the way of white, but they are also the instruments of the world's continued rot. The alternative is the Dark Lord ending, where the player simply turns their back on the flame and walks out of the kiln. As the Chosen Undead leaves, the small spark finally dies, and the kiln is plunged into total darkness. Outside the gates, the primordial serpents bow to the player, hailing them as the Dark Lord who has ushered in the Age of Dark. This ending represents the natural progression of the world, where the Age of the Gods is finally allowed to end, so that the Age of Humanity can begin. It is a rejection of Gwyn's tyranny and his artificial light, allowing the world to return to the shadows of the furtive pygmy. The Dark Lord ending is often seen as the true path for humanity, as it breaks the shackles of the darksign and allows humans to claim their own destiny. But it is also an ending of total uncertainty, as no one knows what a world of pure dark will truly look like. Gwyn's propaganda had taught the world to fear the dark as a state of total chaos, and walking into it requires a level of courage that few possess. By walking away, the player is ending the dream of Anor Londo forever, ensuring that the sun of the gods will never rise again. It is a cold, silent victory that brings the long tragedy of Gwyn to its final, definitive close. These two endings represent the fundamental conflict of the Souls series, the choice between a beautiful, comfortable lie and a harsh, unknown truth. Gwyn had given his life for the lie, and the player must decide if that sacrifice was worth repeating. Whether the world remains in a state of flickering fire or sinks into the primordial dark, the legacy of the Lord of Sunlight is finally over. The flame that ignited in the Age of Ancients has either been artificially extended or naturally extinguished, and the story of Lordran reaches its final, inevitable crossroads. The influence of Gwyn does not end with the first game. His spirit and his will live on within the Soul of Cinder, the final boss of Dark Souls 3. The Soul of Cinder is a manifestation of every person who has ever linked the fire, a collective entity that guards the flame at the very end of time. However, it is Gwyn who remains the core of this entity. During the second phase of the final battle, the boss's fighting style shifts significantly, and the music transitions into a reimagined version of Gwyn's somber piano theme. The boss begins to use Gwyn's exact moveset, including his sunlight spears and his aggressive leaping strikes, proving that the original Lord of Cinder is the foundation of the flame. This return of Gwyn at the end of the series is a powerful narrative statement about the nature of the cycle. Even after eons of different lords burning themselves to keep the fire alive, Gwyn's first sin remains the dominant force in the universe. He is the one who started the fire, and he is the one who refuses to let it die, even when the world has been reduced to a pile of literal ash. The Soul of Cinder is the final echo of a god who was too afraid of the dark to let the world move on. When the player fights this entity, they are fighting the entire weight of the Age of Fire's history, led by its first and greatest king. The fact that Gwyn's theme returns in the final moments of the series highlights the tragedy of his persistence. He has become an eternal guardian, a spirit that cannot rest as long as there is still a spark left to protect. The Soul of Cinder is not a person, but a reflex of the fire itself, and Gwyn is the soul of that reflex. It shows that Gwyn succeeded in his goal of prolonging his age. But the result is a world that has become a twisted, unrecognizable mess of overlapping timelines and grey dust. He is the ghost in the machine of reality, a presence that haunts the end of all things. Fighting the Soul of Cinder is a final confrontation with the first sin of the gods. The player is facing the manifestation of 1,000 years of refused endings. Gwyn's moveset in this final encounter is faster and more refined than it was in the first game, representing the fire's desperate, final attempt to defend itself. It is a haunting callback that ties the beginning of the trilogy to its end, showing that the story of Dark Souls has always been, at its heart, the story of Gwyn's inability to say goodbye to his light. He is the beginning and the end, the Lord who brought the sun and the cinder who refused the night. By the time the Soul of Cinder is defeated, the fire is so weak that it can barely sustain a single person, let alone a kingdom. The return of Gwyn's theme at this moment serves as a final, melancholic farewell to the character who defined the entire setting. He has finally reached the end of his influence, as the world of Dark Souls 3 is so decayed that the fire can no longer be truly linked in the way Gwyn once did. The eternal echo of the Lord of Cinder is finally silenced, and the cycle he started in the kiln of the first flame reaches its absolute terminal limit. Part 27, Gwyn's First Sin, Prolonging the Age of Fire. Scholar Aldia in Dark Souls 2 identifies Gwyn's act of linking the fire as the first sin, a term that redefines our understanding of the entire series. In the eyes of the gods, Gwyn was a savior, but from a philosophical and natural perspective, he was a criminal against the order of the world. By refusing to let the fire die, Gwyn committed an act of supreme hubris that threw the universe out of balance. He traded a natural transition for an artificial repetition, cursing the world to a cycle of rot where nothing could truly grow or end. This sin is what created the Undead Curse and the stagnation of Lordran. The concept of the first sin suggests that the Age of Dark was not something to be feared, but a necessary phase of existence that Gwyn was too terrified to accept. Just as life requires death to have meaning, the light of the fire requires the dark of the night to complete the cycle. By forcing the world to remain in a perpetual day, Gwyn caused the world to become a stale, stagnant pond where the water has stopped moving. The rot that Uldir speaks of is the result of this refusal to change. The world is literally falling apart because it has been kept alive for too long. Gwyn's sin was born out of love for his kingdom and fear for his people, but it resulted in a world of endless suffering for humanity. He shackled the dark soul of man to his own soul, forcing humans to suffer the Undead Curse so that his throne could stay standing. This parasitic relationship is the core of the tragedy. The gods stayed in power by feeding on the very humanity they claimed to protect. The first sin was the moment that the Age of Fire stopped being a golden age and started being a prison for every living being in reality. This perspective shifts Gwyn from a heroic figure into a more complex, almost villainous role in the broader history of the world. While he brought light and order, he also brought a permanent state of undeath and decay. He was the man who refused to die, and in doing so, he prevented anything else from ever truly living. The first sin is the reason why every hero who follows in Gwyn's footsteps is ultimately a tragic figure, as they are simply repeating a mistake that was never meant to be made in the first place. Gwyn had doomed the world by trying to save it. Ultimately, the first sin is the foundation of the entire Dark Souls experience. It is the reason for the fading light, the crumbling kingdoms, and the hollowing of souls. Gwyn's decision in the kiln of the first flame was an act of absolute willpower that defied the very nature of time, and the world has been paying the price for that defiance ever since. He was a lord who brought the sun, but he was also a sinner who refused the sunset, leaving the world to wither in a twilight that was never meant to last. Part 28. Final verdict. The Lord who doomed the world. When we look back at the entire story of Gwyn, we see a figure who is perhaps the most tragic and complicated in all of From Software's worlds. He began as a savior, a revolutionary who led his people out of the dark and brought light to a world of stone and fog. He built a civilization of incredible beauty and established an order that allowed life to flourish for thousands of years. He was a man of absolute conviction, a warrior king who led from the front and was willing to give his own soul to protect the people he loved. In the early days of the Age of Fire, Gwyn was a hero in the truest sense of the word. However, the final verdict on Gwyn is overshadowed by his ultimate failure to let go. His fear of the dark and his obsession with his own legacy turned him into a tyrant who was willing to shackle an entire race to his fading fire. By branding humanity with the darksign, he committed a crime against the natural order that cursed the world to a state of perpetual rot. He traded the future for a prolonged present, and in doing so, he ensured that everything he had built would eventually decay into ash and dust. He was a god of light who became a jailer of souls. Gwyn's tragedy is that he was a victim of his own strengths. His unbreakable will, which allowed him to conquer the dragons, was the same will that refused to accept the natural end of his age. He could not understand a world where he was not the sun, and so he chose to burn himself to keep the sun in the sky. The result was a world of hollows and husks, a reality where the fire of life had been replaced by the cinder of repetition. He was the Lord who brought the sun, but he was also the Lord who doomed the world to never see another morning. In the end, Gwyn is a cautionary tale about the cost of power and the danger of holding on too tight. He represents the peak of divine ambition and the absolute bottom of spiritual collapse. When the player finally puts him out of his misery in the kiln, they are witnessing the final, pathetic gasp of a world that has stayed too long at the party. He is the Lord of Cinder, a broken guardian of a pile of ash, a king who had everything and left behind nothing but a scorched legacy. Gwyn's story is the story of the Age of Fire itself, a brilliant, blinding light that eventually turned everything it touched to grey dust. The legacy of Gwyn is the legacy of the cycle, a series of failed attempts to recapture a glory that was always meant to fade. He set the world on a path of endless repetition, where every hero is just another piece of kindling for a dying dream. By refusing to let the fire die, he ensured that the world would never truly live again. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, was the greatest hero and the greatest villain of his world, a man who brought the fire and then spent his final centuries using it to burn the future away. He was the Lord who doomed the world, and his name is written in the ash of everything that followed.